Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the takeaway of China's two sessions, which is China's parliamentary meeting. I'm Chaosong Yan. I'm the executive editor of the South China Morning Post. I know that this is every year a key event for people who are interested in China to try to get an idea of the country's development strategy and its economy. So at SCMP, we have extensive coverage on the event. And we also have a premium product called SCMP Plus, where you can read our daily insight on the event and also other in-depth infographics, fact sheet, etc. But we are also want to invite some external experts to give our reader their lowdown of their takeaway from the two sessions. So today, I'm very happy that we have the experts from the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China. We have Neil Thomas, who is an expert in politics, and we also have Lisa Li, who is the expert on China's economy. So I think I hope that this webinar can help us to really understand a bit more about China's two sessions and where the country is heading to. So first, maybe we start with Lisa. So because the two session traditionally is always an important occasion for the country to set its economic targets. It's also the occasion when you have the detailed budget planning and the NDRC report, which is China's economic planner, to explain what is the development focus, etc. So, Lisa, I want to ask, maybe start the webinar with this question: is that this year China set the growth target at 5%. It's actually exactly the same as last year. And we all know that last year actually is not a smooth sailing for China's economic growth, even though eventually Beijing announced it has achieved the target of 5%. But there are a lot of skepticism about that. And also, particularly in the third quarter, I think we have seen some quite alarming signs of the economy losing the steam. This year, the growth target will be the same, but China's external environment is actually going to become even more challenging because of the President Donald Trump's tariff on China, because of the trade friction with major partner like EU, and also because there's still a recovery, but some people say not yet a full recovery of China's domestic consumption. So this 5% sounds to be a daunting task. Yet, at this two session from our frontline reporters, we get a sense of optimism among the delegates. So, Lizzie, can you tell us what is your take of China's economy now? And do you think the 5% is an achievable target? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm excited to be part of this collaboration between Center for China Analysis and SCMP. So on growth target, you are absolutely right that 5 percentage point growth target is the same roughly in the benchmark as last year. So what does it really mean? Is it achievable? I think the short answer is yes, it is achievable, but it is not a given. And it really depends on a series of factors, external factors, as you point out, but I think the crucial dependent factor here is whether Beijing can successfully boost its domestic consumption and restore private sector confidence. The reality is right now, the old growth drivers, including export and infrastructure spending, are just not enough. The infrastructure part is easy to understand with property market downturn, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at GDP growth last year and unpack that number, what we see is export pulled a lot of weight last year, contributing to, if I'm remembering correctly, roughly a third of GDP growth last year. But that might not be sustainable this year, especially with rising trade restrictions, not just from the US, but also from Europe. Meanwhile, if you look at domestic consumption, it's still quite weak. It's still anemic. It's not quite up to 45% of GDP growth last year, which is still below pre-pandemic levels. I think that speaks to the length of post-COVID recovery and how slow and painful this process has been. So why isn't Chinese consumer spending? I think the real issue here is not that people don't have money, is that they don't have the certainty and confidence to spend. There's still a lot of wait and hold. There's still a lot of economic anxiety going on in the society. If you look at household savings, it's now more than China's entire GDP. That's a pretty clear telling sign of the kind of uncertainty that people hold, the kind of precautionary savings people are hoarding. So if consumers don't feel secure, they're going to holding back their wallet. I think that's a real issue here. From the two sessions, what we're seeing is the government knows this, or at least finally is coming to the realization of this fact, which I think is why they're taking more steps to boost domestic consumption, especially consumer confidence. So we are seeing very positive message to ease pressure on private businesses, especially in tech and some of the most innovative sectors, which previous crackdowns hurt investment. And we're also seeing this very interesting message to boost asset prices, including property market prices and stock market prices. And the logic behind that is asset prices have wealth effects. And those are actually the top messages coming out of Premier Li Qiang's government work report. So the 5 percentage point growth rate is definitely possible. But to get that number, Beijing really needs to meaningfully boost domestic consumption. And to meaningfully boost domestic consumption, Beijing really needs to first restore confidence, and also relatedly, Beijing must revive investor, especially private investors' confidence in its ability to manage its economy. If businesses and households remain very cautious as they are right now, I mean, China might still hit the number on paper, but it won't really feel like a recovery. And I think that's going to be a problem for Beijing policymakers. And because of that imperative to deliver GDP growth, we actually, our Center for China Analysis in our preview paper actually predicted that consumption will be the top one policy priority. And that's exactly, sort of what happened. As we saw during Premier Li Qiang's government work report, consumption was indeed named the #1 priority.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think you are very, very right that the confidence is really the key. And part of that confidence, as you well said, is actually the wealth effect, right? Your investment in the stock, in property, if it's continue to fall, then it's very hard for people to have the confidence to spend. So one thing curious we found is that at the last year's two sessions, actually I remember both the Hang Seng Index, the Hong Kong stock market, as well as China's Shanghai A share, they were at a quite low base. And this time we checked, so we compare these two sessions and the last two sessions. Actually, you see that the Hong Kong Hang Seng Index has risen from like 17,000, around 17,000 to today is around 24,000. And then the Shanghai A-share index, you also see almost a 30% increase. So if you compare with other major stock market in the world, you can see that actually the China's stock market recovery is actually quite amazing. It's probably one of the best performing place. And then the property also showing some signs of recovery. But people are still very cautious about this. So there's a lot of question whether this is just a flash in the pan, if this is just a Beijing trying to engineer a kind of optimism during the two session and using the so-called the national fund to push up the share prices, whether this is really a bull run, whether it will last. And ultimately, for a lot of overseas investors, the question is China really becoming investable again? So I think this will be very key for the Chinese, particularly for the middle class and also the private sectors. If they will see the continuation of this bull run, maybe there's a real chance the confidence will be back. So what is your take on that?
Right, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of buzz around AI breakthroughs. Actually, I think we heard AI in every single government official's press briefing, including Foreign Minister Wang Yi's briefing. He
Yes.
mentioned DeepSeek, including Wu Qing's briefing. He's like, well, these days, if you don't talk about DeepSeek, you're kind of, you're kind of old-fashioned. You're no longer sort of, considered, updated on these things. So is it just hype? Is it just, kind of a policy engineered bull market? Well, first, it's not just hype. And I think there are two fundamental pillars, two key forces at play supporting this bull run. First, there's real tech breakthrough. DeepSeek R1, for example. If we sort of look back at the stock market history, the release of DeepSeek R1 just completely changed the narrative and mood around China's AI capabilities. It's no longer just catching up to the global frontier. It's actually setting global benchmarks in some sense. And I think markets are clearly taking notice. You're absolutely right. If you look at, ATX, the tech index of Hong Kong market, it has surged roughly 30 percentage points since its release. Yep. And if we look at MSCI China, I think the index has surged more than 20%. So that's quite significant. Clearly, investors are seeing this as more than just a flash in the pan. There's some actual real tech through underpinning this. So that's number one. Number two, there's a major policy support, sort of bolstering this trend. As we saw from the two sessions, in the meetings prior to two sessions, including last year's Central Economic Work Conference, AI, semiconductor, robotics, quantum computing, AI plus industries, these are not just investors' buzzwords. They're actually at the core of China's long-term strategy to reduce reliance on foreign tech and to climb the global value chain. So if you look at China's history of growth, for the past decades, growth was largely fueled by infrastructure and real estate. And we know that model is not sustaining. So it's quite clear from Beijing that the next wave of economic growth will be driven by homegrown tech breakthroughs, industrial upgrades, especially AI-driven productivity gain. So that policy signal is quite consistent and quite strong. And I think that's another pillar supporting this bull run. So it's not just a hype, but I think, a crucial part of your question is it going to be a structural transformation? Is it something more fundamental? Is it a reset to China's stock market? It could be at this point, but I think the real question is on execution. We know from experience that Beijing's policy support doesn't always play out as intended. And, tech breakthroughs are inherently uncertain and risky. Who knows if the next DeepSeek will come from China or some other countries? And, for those two uncertainties, I'm actually less concerned about the second part. I think Chinese entrepreneurs and China's tech companies are some of the most ambitious and diligent and resourceful in the world. I think the bigger risk is actually the former part on the policy side. Will Beijing restore investor confidence so that China's tech sectors actually attract the so-called patient capital? Because we know state capital is not enough to sustain China's entire tech ecosystem? Will Beijing follow through on its promise to support private enterprises? Will state-sponsored R&D funding go to the right projects, or will corruption and nepotism get in the way, as we saw in the big funds, the previous 2 rounds of big funds? So I think those are real risks, and I have no clear answer on that part. But if China gets it right, I think there is the possibility that we're looking at a real economic shift. If China doesn't get it right, we might just see the same kind of stock market boom and bust cycle that have plagued previous industrial policy pushes and previous stock market bull run, especially in 2014 and 2015. So the answer at this point is still very much uncertain, but I'm definitely very interested in this area, and definitely I think this is something worth on the lookout for.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think you touched on 2 very critical points for me. So I want to follow up on that. So the first thing is I totally agree with you about the key of implementation, because before the 2 sessions, everyone reported this, how Xi Jinping organized this meeting together with the private entrepreneurs, particularly the tech leaders. And of course, Jack Ma. So that really sort of sent a very strong message directly from the man himself that the crackdown on the tech is over. That certainly creates a sense of optimism. But a lot of people say that in China, it's not just the top leaders' decision is important. It's also important how the decision actually trickle down the bureaucracy and translate into the actual policies, right? In the past, we have seen that they hold a Politburo meeting, they hold the economic planning meeting, and they say they want to restore the private sector confidence. But when we send reporters to actually do the on-the-ground reporting, we found that the implementation is the problem. The local authorities sometimes have to balance very conflicting demand and very conflicting needs. They have been under tremendous pressure to balance the books, and sometimes they have to find ways to squeeze the private sector in order to make the ends meet. So how do you think that in this year on the implementation side, do you think that there will be any change? Or what will be your advice to the China's policymakers? How can they improve on this very critical front?
So I think you are absolutely right, and you actually hit the nail on the head that the real problem is that local bureaucrats are facing a variety of conflicting demands, right? Beijing want to rein in local debts. Beijing also want to, deliver sort of, want local governments to support social welfare programs, to support consumption, and to support private business. So where does the money come from? And I think that brings us to another very critical question, which is local debt problem, which is at the heart of all of this. And in the short term, I think China can still handle its problem because the central government still has a lot of control over its financial system. If you look at China's sovereign debt to GDP ratio, that's around 80%, which is much lower than Japan. Japan is 260%. It's much lower than the US, which is more than 120 percentage point. So that gives Beijing some breathing room. And what we're seeing over the past few years is Beijing is sort of using its central budget, which is relatively robust and strong, to bail out and restructure some of the debts at the local government level. We saw actions on rolling over bad debts, basically asking state-owned banks to extend the credits to struggling local governments. We saw fiscal transfers, redistributing some of the central government funds to local governments. We saw debt swap facilities, and last year there was a 10 trillion RMB debt swap. The idea behind it is to replace expensive local debts with cheaper government funds. So we saw those actions sort of, at least in the short term, trying to resolve local government's debt issues. But for China, this problem is much bigger. In the US, we also talk about debt problem, but that's fundamentally different from China's problem. So what really needs to change, I think, for implementation to have more robust footing for local bureaucrats to actually be able to implement Beijing's ambitious policy is actually structural fiscal reform to actually fix the core issues. Because the issue is simple. Local governments simply don't have stable revenue streams. You cannot ask them to do a lot of things to push forward your agenda when they don't have the resources. In Chinese, we say 巧妇难为无米之炊, right? No matter how smart a wife is, she cannot cook without rice. So, I think that's a real challenge for Beijing for the upcoming year. And there's actually an urgency to it. We know real fiscal reform takes multiple years, but Beijing has to get it started this year. The challenge for China is China can no longer just grow its way out of debt. When China's economy was in, while GDP growth was in a double digit, it generates fiscal cushion for China, for local governments to keep spending. But now the economy is slowing, and that trend is not going to revert. 5 percentage point GDP growth just does not generate the same fiscal cushion as China did a decade ago. So what need to change for Beijing? I think there are several things. First, local bureaucrats have to have more fiscal authority. That includes, sort of fixing the structure of local tax bases, including local tax management authority. Also, restructuring tax sharing mechanisms, adjusting VAT tax sharing ratios, and also relocating consumption tax collection to a later stage. Currently, it's collected at the production level, but it should be collected at the retail level, so local governments actually get a bigger share of consumption tax. And also, just gradually reallocating more tax revenue to local governments. But there's a tension there because Beijing still wants authority. Beijing still wants final say on how it's going to use its resources. So that's a delicate balance here. And, for transfer payments, currently there are a lot of earmarked transfers. I think what we will see in the next few years is those are going to be repurposed to general purpose transfers just to improve efficiency and flexibility in local fiscal management. So that's really the key. Local bureaucrats have to have the resources. And to do that, Beijing has to be willing to give local bureaucrats a greater share of the total pie of its tax revenue without losing control. So the tension, is actually quite delicate. But if Beijing does not do that, and I think local governments are going to be locked in the same dilemma and will be dragging its feet and not be able to deliver what Beijing promises to the private enterprises.
Thank you, Lizzie. You actually answered my second question with one answer. So one answer for two questions, because my second question actually was about the debt and also the tension between the central government and the local government. You're absolutely right. If you look at China's amazing 40 years of reform and modernization, one of the key steps actually happened in the early stage of the reform was this reset the revenue and the tax balance of power between the central government and the local governments. And during the I think what the Zhu Rongji era, right, is a very difficult but very important and critical step Premier Zhu at the time did, is how to reset the relationship. And now many people say that, well, in this stage for a reset. And then how it play out will be very interesting, because this is actually part of China's history in our DNA, is always how to balance the central government, its authority and its control, versus the local government's needs. If you keep them under too tight a leash, then you kill the kind of creativity and the spontaneous incentive for development. If you lose too much, then you will have this very strong local government disobeying the central government's order. So how to reach that balance? I think that probably will be a key thing for China's politics for maybe the coming years. But some people also talk about the debt. Another concern is that this time around, Premier Li Qiang has raised the deficit spending for the central government from 3% to 4%. 4% is actually, I don't think in recent time we have that high, because they have tried to have a very tight discipline of keeping the deficit spending within 3%. So 4% is really raising the eyebrow. And there are hints that they may even go further if it's necessary. So people ask, is this relax of fiscal discipline something that we should worry about? And also the question is about the efficiency of bureaucrats using resources, whether that will lead to the more white elephant project, whether that will create the kind of wastage and even corruption. What's your take on that?
Right. So I understand the concern over physical, over physical deficit, especially, if you're in the US, if you listen to the news, all people talk about is whether US debt is sustainable or not. I think the issue for China is not spending too much; it's actually spending too little. The four percentage point deficit this year is a big shift for China, but by international standard, it's still quite low. And I think what it shows is that Beijing is at this point prioritizing economic recovery, and I don't think that's a bad thing for China. And if we look at sort of the difference between US and China, who are both facing serious debt challenges, I think the debt problem for China is very different from that of the US. For the United States, debt is piling up because of its chronic deficit spending driven by tax cut, stimulus programs, entitlement programs, et cetera, et cetera. And the US has been able to sustain that, at least for now, because of one key advantage, which is the dollar status as the world's top reserve currency. So, global investors still see US treasuries as the safest assets, which allows the US government to borrow at very low cost for many years. But now the problem for US is that privilege is tested. It's no longer a given. And when interest rate is low, the United States can borrow relatively cheaply. But now the interest rate environment globally is quickly changing. And also, emergence of alternative currencies are playing a bigger role in trade settlements. So the dominance of US is weakened. It's not challenged yet, but the foundation is definitely not as strong as it was before. So that's a debt problem for the United States. For China, as we chatted, just a few minutes ago, the central government, the sovereign government, still has a lot of control over financial system. The sovereign debt to GDP ratio is strong and robust. It's safe. The real issue is at the local level. In some sense, it's hidden, and in some way, it's structurally more dangerous. Local governments have spent decades financing their infrastructures and social programs with land sales, off the books borrowings. And now with this property market downturn, that revenue stream has collapsed. So many local cities are in distress. That's China's real debt problem. So when we talk about China's debt problem, I don't think deficit itself is the crucial issue. What's really significant and what's really a potential sort of systemic threat to China's financial health is actually what we just talked about, which is the local debt issue. So deficit, I'm not too concerned at this point. And you are absolutely right. If trade tensions between China and the United States turn out to be more detrimental to China's economy, as Beijing previously predicted. Later this year, during NPC meeting, we might actually see more deficit spending. And I think that will be the right call at that point.
Thank you. And thank you also bring up this topic of trade war with the US. So we heard from multiple sources that President Donald Trump very much wanted to have a summit with President Xi Jinping in the nearest time. Now, both sides are still working on that. We don't know how early it could be, but some people hope it can happen even next month. But let's say when the two big guy in the room, people are asking what kind of grand bargain Donald Trump will want to cut with Xi Jinping. Whether the US will use the tariff. The tariff definitely is a leverage, but it's not an end in itself, some people believe. So what US really wants to get from China. And then also the earlier we talked about China's technology breakthrough. Right now there is a certain level of optimism in Beijing. So I remember 3 years ago when they first released, when the US side first released the ChatGPT, that's also during the around the two session time. I talked to some Chinese think tank or people here, and they seem to be quite concerned. They don't know whether this will actually create a gap, a technology gap between China and the US. And then the following year, when I come to the two session again, I think that level of anxiety definitely dropped quite significantly. And this time around, there's actually a sense of optimism. They think that the small yard high fence proved to be ineffective, and China can continue achieve all this breakthrough despite of the tech restriction. And some people are also asking whether the US will start to think about this and start to adjust its small yard high fence policy, because in the end, you may only end up creating a China that don't need to depend on you and can still achieve all these breakthroughs. So what's your take? Do you think that what kind of bargain Trump will be want to get from Beijing? And also on the tech restriction front, do you see there's any possibility of a reset, or you think the mood is still very much the same?
Right. I mean, I think it definitely depends on how you look at it. I mean, on the surface, when Trump and Xi meet up, there are the usual suspects, right? That are at the front and center of people's mind: trade tensions, tax restrictions, as you mentioned, and also issues like fentanyl, which has been a political talking point here in the United States. But I think the thing is, those issues are not going to be resolved at the top leadership summit. Real negotiations on those issues tend to be long, they tend to be detailed, there tend to be a lot of back and forths, and they tend to happen behind closed doors in the lead up to the summit. I think what really matters for Xi Jinping and Trump isn't necessarily the substance on those specific issues, but the political optics. I think both leaders want to walk away from the summit claiming they have scored a diplomatic win. So paradoxically, the real issues are not resolved at the leadership level. The leadership level is more about what appears to the world. And I think for Xi Jinping, that diplomatic victory means a projection of strength. Xi Jinping wants his domestic economy to be in good shape, to demonstrate that he can handle Trump's pressure, and to protect China's core interest. And for Trump, I think it's a little less predictable what Trump's team actually want from that meeting. His team might want to frame it as proof of the president's deal-making ability. That might signal that might hint at a sort of a larger bargain at play. Or maybe President Trump wants to signal to its domestic audience that, oh, I got China to pay up and make concessions. And that might actually involve a very limited deal with China with, more sort of trade promises from China. So, I think, both forces are at play. At this point, it's really hard to say what will be delivered at the summit. But if there's one thing that's predictable about President Trump, it's the fact that he thrives on unpredictability. And I think that unpredictability is the ultimate X factor, and that's going to shape the way this plays out. And on your restrictions, on your question on export restrictions, definitely, I think China is closing the gap with U.S. tech, and that has raised a lot of questions about whether U.S. export controls have been effective or not. But I think it's important to recognize that the landscape, the competitive landscape between U.S. and China is still very much uneven. The U.S. still maintains a lead in foundational AI models, semiconductor design, and also its software ecosystem. What China is leapfrogging is in commercial AI applications, industrial AI deployments. We see areas where scale, industrial ecosystem, and the size of the market, the depth of the market matter the most, like autonomous driving, smart manufacturing, right? AI robotics, AI plus healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a two-track competition with the United States, or multi-track competition with the United States. High-end semiconductors are still the biggest bottleneck for China. And I think US export controls work in a sense that it has made it tough for Chinese firms to access cutting-edge chips and forcing China's hands. China has to adapt by focusing on expanding domestic foundries and developing AI models that can run on less powerful chips. And that's not ideal. And I think, that might actually run into further hurdles as China charge on along this road. So I don't want to say that, oh, China has just, broken the curse of export control. That's just not as simple as that. So I think China is not overtaking the United States outright, but China is carving out in strategic important areas where it leads, where it can safeguard its domestic economy, where it can, sort of erect those guardrails against U.S. export control policy. And that has forced a lot of rethinking in Washington, which I think is correct and is a necessary step to look at and see how this has actually played out and how this will play out in the long run. What's certain is that the perception that China is just a copycat, China is just a follower of US tech, that area is over. I think, the US is likely to remain dominant in core AI research and advanced semiconductors, but China has proved itself to be a formidable innovative force.
Lizzie, so you are very right. This is a very nuanced analysis. And I think that when it comes to the absolute high-tech competition, US is still, some people say 5 to 10 years ahead of China. But China's advantage really is in manufacturing. So as we see in the chips, right, China is making a lot of progress in the production of legacy chips. So China's thinking is that they will use this advantage in the industrial scale and also the manufacturing to compensate for the disadvantage in the high-tech sector. So to buy time to gradually catch up. So how do you think this rivalry will play out? And also, because the time is running short, I want to ask this last question, but also use this opportunity to thank Lizzie for this very interesting, very nuanced analysis of China's economy. And I definitely hope when the two presidents, when they meet again, we can organize a similar webinar like this.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm so glad to be a part of this very interesting conversation. I think your question is way above my pay grade, and I really don't have sort of a clear stance on this. But what I know for sure is we should get ready for a lot of uncertainty. We should get ready for a lot of volatility, a lot of surprises and turns and twists. It is going to be a very interesting period of China journalists and China watchers alike. Definitely an interesting area to watch. And I also thank South China Morning Post for providing exclusive insights, especially on the potential of a Trump-Xi meeting, which I first learned from the great reporting from South China Morning Post. So keep journalists on the ground is very important for us to actually get a granular understanding of how this power play is going to fan out in the next decade or so. And I think having that insight into China, having that unique on the ground lens to understand what's actually going on in China is sort of what ultimately is behind the mission of the Center for China Analysis, which makes this collaboration very meaningful.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very thrilled that we have Neil Thomas here with us. Neil is from the Asia Society's Policy Institute's Center for China. And Neil is here with us to discuss about the two sessions. That is China's parliamentary meeting. It's an annual event, and once a year, we basically have all the political elite of China gathering in Beijing. Now, over the past few years, the two sessions have become largely about China's economy and domestic politics, but it is still a very critical occasion for China watchers to look for signs about China's foreign policy and its grand strategy, how it's going to deal with the external world. So, Neil, I want to start our session by asking you, in your observation of this year's two sessions, is there anything that surprised you? What is your main takeaway of the two sessions? What are the things that you think are interesting and people should pay attention to?
Thanks, Chungyan, and thanks for having me on this webinar. In terms of the two sessions, I wouldn't say anything was particularly surprising. From a kind of foreign policy grand strategy point of view, the most interesting event was the annual press conference that Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave a couple of days into the session. And it really just kind of crystallized a lot of the emerging themes of China's foreign policy in this second Trump administration here in Washington, D.C. I mean, Wang Yi really sought to project China as the responsible actor in the world, a force for stability, and a real champion of the existing order of economic globalization with free trade and foreign investment being promoted and encouraged. And that's a message that still resonates with a lot of the world, especially developing nations. And I think we're quite clearly seeing how Beijing's trying to distinguish itself from Washington and trying to boost its own claim to diplomatic leadership by drawing not a direct but a pretty clear implicit contrast with what it portrays as the chaos and unpredictability and unreliability of the Trump administration. The other, I think, really interesting thing that happened on a foreign policy note at the two sessions was a little bit more micro, and that was some remarks that the special envoy for European affairs, Liu Xiaoye, made on the sidelines of the CPPCC, the political advisory body's sessions. And he said, he's talking about Europe and Trump, and he said that the Trump administration's policies towards Europe were appalling. He said that China's policies were obviously much better in his view, but also some specific things that the future of Ukraine shouldn't be decided by just the US and Russia, implying that not only Ukraine but also Europe should be at the table in a way that it's not under the current US, Ukraine, Russia talks. And he even went as far as to say that the US is even more pro-Russia than China. I think he said that, China supports Russia, China leans towards Russia, but the US is kind of actively supporting Russia's war at this point. We're close to his exact words. So really a pretty unusual, interesting set of remarks. I mean, Liu Xiaoye is kind of known as a wolf warrior, but this is a very kind of conciliatory tone towards Europe, tough towards the US for sure. But definitely a sign, I think, coming from perhaps the very top, that Beijing wants to explore the possibilities for repairing some of the damage in China-EU relations. Now we have the change of administration in the US and the kind of quite major falling out that is possible between the US and Europe on the future of Ukraine.
Thank you. I think you really nailed it because at the two session, I think normally they don't talk about other countries. It tend to be a very internally focused kind of event. But U.S. is actually looming large in every conversation, and you're absolutely right. I think China is trying to use every opportunity to contrast with what's happening in the U.S. right now. So project China as a dependable, reliable, and also consistent power. The foreign policy is very much consistent. So they like to emphasize when it comes to Ukraine, China's policy from day one, China's position from day one, as compared with now, remain the same. While as, of course, the biggest change on that front is the US policy. And it's not only alarming to Europe, but China is also using this to tell the countries in Asia, you have to look at Ukraine. So, I mean, I remember when the Ukraine war first started, there's a slogan say, today's Ukraine, tomorrow's Taiwan, South China Sea, whatever. But today, nobody wants to mention that again because nobody really wants to be the next Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you is that this is certainly a very interesting dynamic. So many people are saying the reason why President Donald Trump is making such a sudden change is actually precisely because the US realized it cannot fight a two-front war, right? And ultimately, the bigger challenge in the long run is going to come from China. So they want to end the conflict in Europe and then reach the kind of friendly reapproachment with Russia, and then see if the US can really focus on China. So that's a question of how far the US can go to repair its relations with Russia, and whether Moscow will really flip to the US side. And just like what we see 40 years ago when China joined the US side to contain the USSR. So to what sense you think that this kind of speculation is close to reality?
It's a great question because it's on so many people's minds in capitals across the world. I think in the short term on the issue of Ukraine negotiations, I think what you outlined is certainly a school of thought, right? The prioritizers who want to move attention away from Europe, from the Middle East to some extent, and refocus in a massive way towards East Asia and specifically China, and even more specifically the Taiwan Strait, to deter what they see as being a potentially imminent military action or invasion by China, which in my view is not quite that likely, although there's obviously reasons to be concerned and to maintain significant deterrence. But for Trump himself, I think the real motivator is actually just to do a deal because he promised people in the election that he'd be able to end this. He said on day one, and that's now changed to, I think, the first 100 days and could keep on expanding further. But, he believes in himself as a deal maker. He wants to show that he gets things done in a way that his predecessors, like Joe Biden, could not. And he wants to have political wins to show to the American people. And we're right now in the middle of a big test of that strategy because the US and Ukraine reached a ceasefire deal just the other day, but we still haven't got word on whether Putin will agree to that. And there's indeed reporting coming out today that maybe he'll make additional demands on that ceasefire. And we have seen a couple of times in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, Trump come out and put pressure on Russia, and really press to Putin that usually through tweets or truths that he wants to make a deal done, that Russia will have to make some compromises. But if Russia does not want to make any compromises in a way that means Ukraine will not sign up to any deal, then we could still see this US-led peace process fall apart, which would potentially drive something of a wedge between Trump and Putin and this kind of closer US-Russia relationship. It's a bit too fluid to make any solid calls about that yet. Trump is certainly a much better prospect for Putin than Biden was in terms of getting a favorable resolution for Russia to the Ukraine war, and more generally, a favorable American foreign policy towards Russia. And there's some interest in restarting economic relations under the Trump administration too, which were basically severed after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 when Biden was president. But there is, we shouldn't assume that it's a certainty that the US and Russia will become incredibly close. They might become closer, but this negotiating process could complicate the degree to which there is a true rapprochement. And to the broader question you asked at the end about the so-called reverse Nixon of, basically getting much closer to Russia in a way that would isolate China. I think it's a nice idea for armchair geopolitical analysts to contemplate. But if we look at the reality of the China-Russia relationship, it's a whole lot different to when Nixon was going about his diplomacy. At that point in time, 1971, Kissinger goes on his secret trip. 1972, Nixon visits China, first sitting US president to do so. China and the Soviet Union were already at least 12 years into a bitter ideological, political, economic divide that saw them, almost go to war, and indeed, shots being fired and people dying on the border. And right now, China and Russia have, in some senses, arguably never been closer. Record levels of trade and investment, really, fairly close coordination on international diplomacy and summitry, and also growing, military drills being conducted together and more sharing of defense technology. Now, both Beijing and Moscow have, a relatively high degree of skepticism towards the other and are wary about getting too close. They are not allies. They do not have a mutual defense agreement, and I don't think they'll ever get close to one. China didn't send all the weapons that Russia wanted. Russia hasn't shared all the technology on things like nuclear submarines that China might have wanted for its economic support, at least during after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, while it's true, there's certainly some wiggle room for the US to draw Russia, maybe slightly closer to Washington than it is now. I think the idea of splitting Beijing and Moscow in a strategic sense in terms of their orientation towards the international order, which is currently quite close, the prospect of doing that is very low.
I absolutely agree with you, Neil, because I know that a lot of talk about the reverse Nixon, but the reality on the ground, as you very rightly put, the circumstances, the dynamics is very different from the Cold War era. Actually, what I noticed is the Russian side and the Chinese side, they so far have kept the communication channel between the Putin and Xi very frequent. So wherever there's Trump talking to Putin, Putin will call Xi or Xi will call Putin. So to make sure that the other side will not have to second guess what's going on. And this year, one thing interesting is at the Wang Yi's press conference, he also mentioned China is going to invite Putin to and other Shanghai Cooperation Organization members to Tianjin to commemorate the end of the Second World War, the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And China will even stage a military parade for that. And Xi is also going to visit Moscow. So I think China will very much use this opportunity to demonstrate that not only China's close relations with Russia, but both Russia and the Soviet Union and China are victors from the Second World War and part of the founding members of that world order. So they are trying to portray themselves as the protector and also the guarantor of that post-war world order. Well, to contrast with the other, because they have been always been portrayed as the revisionist power. So I think this is a way for them to counter that narrative. But to a lot of the smaller countries, the main thing is not just what you say. They also want to see how China can demonstrate it is really a responsible power, guarantor of the world order, particularly as the U.S. is seen as withdrawing from the world theater. So in your view, do you think China right now is really projecting a convincing enough image to not to the West, not to the US, but to the smaller countries in Asia, in other parts of the world, as a responsible and dependable power?
I'd say that China's approach to what is often broadly described as the global South has been fairly consistent, and has focused on this leadership in global governance, maintaining and often increasing its support for these pillars of the international order, things like the United Nations and its kind of constituent bodies, things like the World Health Organization, that the United States has been withdrawing from over the last few weeks. And I think that's a signal to the developing world that China wants to stay the course with the system that they have become accustomed to and which they want to progress in. I think that's a pretty consistent preference across most of the developing world. And we've also seen China in the last few decades, maybe especially so under Xi Jinping's leadership, step up its investment and its trade with the developing world. So the Belt and Road Initiative kind of stands out as the obvious example here, which initially focused a lot on these massive infrastructure investments, which sometimes paid off, but sometimes caused lots of problems. They ran out of money, or they created environmental and social negative externalities. But now we're seeing that being shifted a bit towards new focuses on things like tech partnerships, more local manufacturing, sustainable development. And I think we shouldn't underestimate Chinese foreign policy. And if you trace the development of what is being called the Belt and Road Initiative, its content has changed, fairly significantly over the last 12 years or so since it was announced. And the focus now is on learning from the mistakes of the past and doing projects which are still very much in what Xi Jinping sees as China's national interests, but which are less wasteful and which generate more sustained support on the ground. Obviously, there'll always be problems with development projects. There are for any country playing that role. the United States, Europe, the UK included. But these debt concerns are something that China itself has taken notice of. It doesn't want to keep losing money, and it's not seizing assets in exchange for debt, as the kind of debt trap diplomacy narrative would have it. It's just coming out worse off economically. So it has brutally self-interested reasons to improve the terms of its economic diplomacy with the developing world. And the other interesting development, I think, in this space that deserves watching is less a reflection on what China has been doing and how effective that's been, and how convincing it is, but more looking forward into where China wants to go. And that is kind of the shift from transactional diplomacy under things like the Belt and Road Initiative to a more normative diplomacy under Xi Jinping's three global initiatives: the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the original one, the Global Development Initiative, which all involve small pots of money here and there, but which, at least in my interpretation, are more about serving as vehicles to communicate and to kind of expand the influence of China's normative ideas about how the global development, security, and perhaps civilizational, cultural, or normative frames should be constructed. So moving development to a more state-friendly direction, moving security to a less alliance-friendly direction, moving, you could say, civilization, culture, norms to a more of a focus on collective human rights over individual human rights. I think it's a really important shift in the approach to diplomacy, not just the content of diplomacy, and the extent to which those initiatives gain support in the next few years, is still quite new, will be an important reflection, I think, of China's success in this regard, of convincing the rest of the world that it is a better option than the United States. I think it's still very much an open question. A lot of countries want to maintain good ties with the US for security protection, for economic development, because of the amazing technology ecosystem here, for reasons of democracy and human rights as well, where the US is still very much more associated with the existing order. But we're in a period of flux in global geopolitics. So I just highlight these three initiatives and their international support as a key watch point going forward.
Thank you, Neil. It's a very spot-on observation about the shift in China's policy. You earlier mentioned that President Donald Trump is known as, or hope to be known as, the deal maker. And we have reported that the both sides are making preparation and hope that Trump and Xi can have a summit very soon. Sometime, some people say maybe even next month, or some people say maybe in June. But the one thing for certain is that both sides are making preparation for this to happen. So what kind of grand strategic deal you think that when the two big men in the room, they will hope to achieve? What kind of big deal you think that Trump will make to Xi?
It's a fantastic question, and one which we can't do much more than make educated guesswork about at the moment, in my view, particularly given how Trump likes to deal in the moment rather than have everything laid out in advance before him, which is something that's making getting to the table a bit more difficult for the Chinese side at the moment. And if we listen to what Trump's been saying, and especially to the only real substantive mention of China in his kind of first State of the Union address, effectively, a few days ago, he does seem to still be in the mindset of the trade deal that he did in the first administration, so the US-China Phase 1 trade deal. He's been mentioning that he wants China to purchase more US agricultural or energy commodities. He wants better opportunities for US firms in China. He wants US factories and industries to be revived by Chinese investment. all things that were, on the table in that phase one negotiation. Now, Trump, wants to salvage that because it's good for his, reputation as a deal maker. He also blames not China, but Joe Biden for the fact that that phase one deal wasn't implemented and didn't come close to achieving its targets. So I think Trump is still very much in a transactional rather than a kind of grand strategic mode when it comes to this negotiation. He may decide he wants to do something bigger and more ambitious by the time the two men get in a room together. But I also think from Beijing's point of view, beyond fairly marginal things, they don't really want to put a lot of the grand strategic issues, such as Taiwan, most obviously, up for negotiation. Like,
Yep.
as far as Beijing is concerned, Taiwan is a domestic internal affair that in no other country should really have any say in. Obviously, that's not necessarily the reality on the ground. And the United States is a huge player in cross-strait relations. I expect that Beijing would want the Trump administration to come out and say that, we oppose Taiwan independence, make that really clear, and remove any uncertainty there. And that's something that Washington could use as some leverage. But in terms of doing a big, concert of Europe, Westphalian type deal to, sort out the relationship for the next few years and decades, maybe I'm less sure that that's going to be on the table than others. There's a lot of barriers to that. There's a lot of hesitancy in Trump's own administration to doing anything more than is necessary when it comes to, making concessions or giving rhetorical wins to China. So I think that a fairly low level ambition deal that does focus on things like China investing more in the US and buying more US products and doing some domestic reforms, which probably will align with their existing policies in exchange for maybe some relaxations of export controls or reductions in tariffs is probably about the biggest space for a deal that exists. But the caveat to that all is, of course, that Trump is an unconventional diplomat and is prepared to do things that people don't expect. So we could see something that's much more ambitious and that is outside of my realm of prediction. But at least as far as I can see at the moment, there's a lot of limits to what's possible in a deal like that.
Thank you, Neil. I found your analysis very spot on and very detailed. Thanks for your time. And I just want to maybe just ask another question before we wrap this up. So you see that Biden administration during its 4 years, one of the big achievements is they have cobbled together an alliance, the Western alliance, but also the allies in Asia, and they're trying to form a united front towards China. Now, as you mentioned, under Trump, US seems to be going back to this transactional deal-making type of diplomacy. So it started to raise alarms among the US allies. So when the shove come to push, whether the US will be still there. One example is that one big news during the two sessions is this Chinese fleet sailing through Philippine Strait and all the way down to Australia and carried out a military drill in the waters near Australia and New Zealand. It caused a lot of anxiety there. And then you have people asking why this is happening and what the US will do or is doing to help us. And then the tensions start to show up not only in the so-called among the allies, but even among the so-called Five Eyes, right? Australia is questioning the US policy. UK is questioning its policy over Ukraine. not to mention Canada. And soon we're going to have the G7 in Canada. Can you imagine what kind of reception Trump will get when he lands in Canada? So the big question in this part of the world, a lot of people is asking whether this is really the fractions start to appear over this united front, or at some stage they will realize it's very important to keep the alliance, and will go back and repair the fence. So what's your take?
My take is that it's important not to underestimate the preferences of allies and partners for the United States compared to China. A lot of governments across the West, across the G7, are quite disturbed and concerned by moves the Trump administration is making. It certainly means that coordination on China policy and on broader diplomatic agendas is going to be a lot more difficult, if not impossible, on some areas, such as climate, for instance. But for most of these capitals, there's still a strong desire to maintain alliances and partnerships with the United States, particularly for allies in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, partners including India. While no one really wants to, abandon China, for example, to go all the way with the USA. They don't want to abandon the USA to go all the way with China. I mean, a lot of these countries are skeptical of China's intentions, of its military modernization, of its industrial capacity, and the potential to hollow out industries in their home countries. So I think that, at first glance, you can see all that's happening and maybe come to an opinion that this is the West unraveling, or this is the end of the US alliance system. And we had many of those takes during the first Trump administration as well. And I think that the level of concern is higher now in Western capitals than it was even back then about where the US foreign policy could go. But I think that for a lot of these countries, they've already made their choice, which is that they're invested in alliances and partnerships with the United States, and that's probably not going to change even after Trump's second term.
Thank you all for joining this fascinating discussion with us. I think it's a great pleasure that we have Neil and Lizzie from the Asia Society to provide the expert insight and also the interpretation of the two sessions.
Thank you.
From the SCMP side, we very much focus on on-the-ground reporting, gathering the important information and facts, but also talk to different experts and trying to give you a very holistic perspective about China. I think given the complexity of the rise of China, this is very much necessary. We hope that going forward, we can organize more events like this to help unbox this very complex phenomenon. Thank you.